Desenvolvimento Científico e Tecnológico, National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. Welcome, João Cezar.
So first of all, let me thank Professor Carlos Mendoza Alvarez for his very kind invitation. And I'm sorry, but Valentina, I'm sorry I had not heard your introduction, but I'm sure that it has been very kind, so I thank you as well. And let me also say that I was very touched by Professor Carlos' words introducing our colleague and friend James Edison. I thought it was a very beautiful acknowledgement of the role of pioneer that James Edison has had in mimetic theory for so many years. So I was really touched, and I would like to mention it. What I will present today is a short paper, about 20 minutes, as Professor Carlos has asked me. And I will try to introduce the concept of collective interdividuality, hoping that it will be discussed and will interest you. So the short communication is called Inter-Dividuality as a Challenge, Mimetic Theory and its Discontents. Inter-Dividuality, as you all know, is the only made-up word in René Girard's mimetic theory, whose key concepts deliberately resort to everyday language: scapegoat, model, mediator, external or internal mediation, conversion, desire. However, as it is frequently the case with Girard's unique way of thinking, even this seemingly commonsensical statement has to be taken with a grain of salt. Take, for instance, the concept of desire. At first, we should know its meaning. At first, we should know its meaning once it is close to our daily usage. Desire in this horizon is a drive towards another. That is, according to the mensonge romantique of our most celebrated dictionaries, and I quote, desire is an emotion or excitement of the mind directed to the attainment or possession of an object from which pleasure, sensual, intellectual, or spiritual, is expected. Desire is a passion excited by the love of an object or uneasiness at the want of it, and directed to its attainment or possession. This is a definition provided by the Webster Dictionary. Do you see how the simplicity of Girard's choice hides the complexity of his system, or as Giuseppe Fornari has called it, a Girard system, or a cathedral, to recall Jean-Pierre Dupuis's definition of mimetic theory? The word is the same, desire. No fancy concept is put forward by Girard. Nonetheless, a radically new horizon is opened by a simple assumption, whose consequences are far-reaching and will lead Girard to come up with nothing less than a personal account of the threshold of human culture. Allow me to return to basic notions, which you all know from inside out, but I do it in order to try to reconstruct a very important internal dynamics of mimetic theory itself, dynamics which has propelled me to propose the concept of collective interdividuality. And here it goes, the internal dynamics of mimetic theory. According to the first stone of mimetic theory, the 1961 Mensonge romantique, vérité romanesque, desire is all but as direct and straightforward as the naive definition advanced by dictionaries suggests. Rather, Girard started to pave the way for his long argument by contradicting the common sense. Desire can only be properly understood if we realize that it springs from another seen as a role model whose supposed superiority entices the subject to desire the object desired by the model, literally a mediator of the subject's desire. As you realize, from a stylistic standpoint, reiteration is a fundamental tool in the description of the mimetic mechanism. This apparently simple notion turns upside down the whole framework of reference concerning subjectivity as it was defined since Romanticism. Instead of a stable, self-centered subject, proud of his self-determination, materialized in the romantic quest for the fulfillment of one's desire, Girard's first book presents us an unstable subject, heterocentric, uncertain about his ability to find by himself valuable objects of desire. The mimetic subject suffers from what Girard has provocatively called mal ontologique. In other words, and this has yet to be fully appreciated and developed, the mimetic subject is, much avant la lettre, a weak subject. It is then no surprise that much later, René Girard and Gianni Vattimo would find so many points in common in their theorization, for the mimetic subject is also a soggetto debole. The simple notion, desire, then starts to unveil its complexity. If one defines his object of desire imitating the desire of his model, logically and even inevitably, they will end up desiring the same object. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the consequences of this relationship. The model, realizing that his object is coveted by someone else, will tend to rekindle his own desire. When it happens, the roles become interchangeable, for the model, who initially was imitated by the subject, now imitates the subject by intensifying the desire he already felt for the object he had previously chosen. In a nutshell, here you have the entire next book by René Girard, the 1971 La Violence et le Sacré, as I will briefly suggest. This undifferentiation of roles is the matrix for conflicts that cannot but escalate once it is ignited. Very much like the famous definition of jealousy offered by Iago, one of the most mimetic characters of the literary tradition. As you remember, Iago defines jealousy as follows: "Oh, be aware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on." Likewise, once started, the mimetic mechanism can hardly be brought to a halt. The escalation to extremes is its natural course. After all, a relationship that took off from the admiration one feels for his or her model, sooner than expected turns into rivalry for the possession of the same object. In other words, imitation has nothing to do with the neutral repetition of a previous example. On the contrary, imitation is the fountainhead of violence. And again, the full development of this insight is the trademark of Girard's work. Right at the beginning of the play, indeed, Iago had sketched an enigmatic self-portrait, which can be rendered much clearer through the lenses propitiated by the mimetic subject. As you remember, Iago says, right in the beginning of the play, first scene, first act, "I am not what I am." Iago does not indulge in the obvious, "I am not who I am," but reveals the extent of his mal ontologique. Iago is a what, which is nothing without the centrality of others who will help him to find his own voice, to finally be able to see his own face. And the staging of the violence, which escalates from this seemingly common perception, is a key strength in Shakespeare's theater as it was fully developed by René Girard in his Shakespeare, the Theater of Envy. And again, Shakespeare provides us with the sharpest and most economic definition of the mimetic subject, and above all, of the concept of inter-dividuality. We are now in the second scene of Act 1 of Julius Caesar. Cassius has to convince Brutus to join the conspiracy against Caesar, or it will never have the necessary legitimacy. But if Brutus joins the conspiracy, so it is no longer a conspiracy, but a defense of the Roman Republic. Cassius praises Brutus eloquently, putting his merits much above Caesar's conquests. Brutus had something intangible and yet irreplaceable, honor and integrity acknowledged by the entire seat of Rome. Then maliciously Cassius asks Brutus, "Tell me, good Brutus, can you see your face?" That is to say, Cassius is asking Brutus, do you know how much are you appreciated by the citizens of the Republic? Or even in a clearly mimetic terms, do you know that the citizens of the Republic praise you more than they praise Caesar? Brutus' reply is in itself a treatise on mimetic desire. So says Brutus, "No, Cassius, for the eye sees not itself, but by reflection, by some other things." That is to say, the subject cannot define himself in a self-centered manner. That's why Cassius offers himself as a mirror, so that Brutus can finally see his image through Cassius' words. Flattered, he joins the conspiracy, and the rest is not silence, but history. The concept of inter-dividuality gives theoretical form to Brutus' statement, the eye sees not itself, but by reflection, by some other things. If the subject is can only truly define his own mutable being by contrast and above all contact with others, then we are all inter-dividuals instead of individuals. Perhaps it is possible to imagine that this conceptualization, this new word, inter-dividuality, was more important to Jean-Michel Urgulian and Guillefort, the two interlocutors of Girard's 1978 book, and indeed Girard's bestseller, Des choses cachées depuis la fondation du monde. Let me try to explain my perspective, which will help me to briefly introduce the concept I have proposed to the development of mimetic theory in contexts other than the European and North American cultures, the concept of collective interdivduality. In 1961, Girard was concerned with literary texts read in a comparative fashion, ranging from Cervantes to Proust, that is, from the early 17th to the 20th centuries. You remember that Don Quixote was published in 1605. Girard developed the basic insights of mimetic theory, taking into account modernity as it was unfolded in Europe. I can be even more precise. Girard first intuited the notion of mimetic desire with all its violent consequences, studying a historical context in which the modern system of justice had already been developed, as well as other means of controlling the disquieting outcome of mimetic rivalries. And the modern system of justice had as a main objective to avoid the endless cycle of revenge, as it was clearly demonstrated in Shakespeare's plays Romeo and Juliet, also studied by René Girard. That is why, in the framework of the 1961 Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque, the conflict the mimetic conflict primarily manifests itself at the individual level and also resolves itself at the same level, the conversion, be it religious or simply humanistic, which helped an individual to come to terms to the mimetism inherent to the human condition. In Mensonge romantique et de vérité romanesque, the main model for this conversion is Dostoevsky, a very powerful author to René Girard's Theorization. In this horizon, a conceptual pair was developed, which provided a true driving force to the whole development of mimetic theory, Mensonge romantique, the romantic lie, and Vérité romanesque, the Romanesque truth. Girard's entire and vast body of work may be seen as gravitating around the two options. In Mensonge romantique, the role of mediator is either fully denied or rendered irrelevant. In Vérité romanesque, on the contrary, the mediator is given pride of place. And you can see that this conceptual pair also is present in the 1971 La violence et le sacré. The mensonge romantique of La violence et le sacré refers to the scapegoat mechanism, to the méconnaissance regarding the scapegoat mechanism, the sheer fact that a group that scapegoats someone does not know that this someone is being scapegoated. The méconnaissance is the mensonge romantique of La violence et le sacré. Et La vérité romanesque is fully developed in the 1978 book, Des choses cachées depuis la fondation du monde. In this book, in 1978, Girard attributed La vérité romanesque to Christianity, once Christ's passion would be above all a denunciation of the scapegoat mechanism. So this conceptual pair, mensonge romantique and vérité romanesque, may allow us to have an X-ray of the entire work by René Girard. The acknowledgement of the conflictive nature of imitation has also given opportunity to the establishment of another conceptual pair, which also accompanies Girard's entire work: external mediation and internal mediation. External mediation happens when subject and mediator are not in the same level, be it physical or spiritual, and therefore their potential rivalry is dissolved by the distance itself. It is the most productive form of imitation, and for instance, Giuseppe Fornari has tried to understand aesthetic as a positive model for external mediation. I myself have tried to show that this may be the case of what I have called poetics of emulation, but I will leave this possibility for another occasion of our conversation after the lectures. Internal mediation happens when subject and mediator are in the same level, be it physical or spiritual, and therefore their potential rivalry is increased by the closeness itself. It is the most conflictive form of imitation and has become predominant since the 1789 French Revolution, and in the contemporary world, with the omnipresence of social networks, this authentic atomic bomb of mimetic desire, internal mediation has become a real problem. I have also tried to show how mimetic theory has become ever more contemporary in the age of social networks, but I will also leave this possibility for another occasion or for our conversation. I have proposed to add a new concept to Girard's arsenal. I refer to the concept of collective inter-dividuality, the consequences of which are extremely important in the cultural history of non-hegemonic contexts, not only Latin America, but non-hegemonic contexts as a whole. The transposition of the mimetic nature of desire from the level of the individual to the collective was obsessively worked over by the broadest variety of Latin American thinkers in the 20th and the 19th and 20th century. If I'm not wrong, and this is my proposal for our discussion today, the concept of collective interdivduality makes it possible to tie together the two ends of Girard's thought, establishing a complex but I hope clear line of continuity between Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque, 1961, and Archivé Clausewitz, the Conversations with Benoit Chantre, published in 2007. While in the first work, the dimension of mimetic desire led to conflicts at the interdividual level, by the second, Battling to the End, as it was translated into English, the escalation of violence is sparked by the transnational transmission of mimetic rivalry, and we are again in the 21st century in the same predicament that was discussed in Battling to the End in Archivé Clausewitz. So, while in the first work, Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque, the dimension of mimetic desire led to conflicts at the interdividual level, by the second, Archivé Clausewitz, the escalation of violence is sparked by the transnational transmission of mimetic rivalry. And it seems to engulf this transmission, this transnational transmission, has a mimetic rivalry that engulfs two major economic and military powers, France and Germany, throughout the 19th century. This rivalry, says Girard, led the world to its present state, with the almost exclusive preponderance of internal mediation, a historical moment I just referred to, which springs from the French Revolution according to René Girard's chronology, mimetic chronology. A Latin America gaze lends particular strength to Girard's affirmation, since the end point for his reflections, collective interdividuality, has been the jumping off point for Latin American cultures. To wit, collective interdividuality. It is as if Brutus' sharp reply to Cassius, the ice is not itself, but by reflection, by some other things. In the case of non-hegemonic cultures, this reply has been fundamental to the definition of an individual, not of an individual, but of a collective interdividuality of the whole nation. Indeed, in his 1971, La violence et le sacré, Girard led his research to the same level, if I'm not mistaken, because in La violence et le sacré, Girard researches a historical period in which precisely the modern system of justice had not yet been developed, and therefore the mimetic conflicts, the mimetic rivalries escalated to the point of brought apart social groups. And then the mechanism of the scapegoat, mechanism was developed. There, the scapegoat mechanism, the mimetic conflict is not solved at the interdividual level, but at the collective interdividual level. This unexpected intersection between Girard's thought and the shaping of non-hegemonic cultures is brought forward by the concept of collective interdividuality. This concept proposes that the centrality of the other on the much broader and more complex plane that is the whole of a nation. This is one of the concepts with which I am not only trying to enrich mimetic theory, but also proposing a new theoretical framework based on the concept of poetics of emulation and Shakespearean cultures. But I will leave this for another occasion as well. That notion would allow us to overcome the dominant model of cultural history, a typical project of romantic extraction, which entails the continuous rediscovery of oneself through the philosophical gesture of reflection, implying a utopian return to a plenitude lost. From this angle, we can make out the models undeniably, and this model is marked by an undeniably Hegelian mark, emerging as the restoration of unity between being and essence. Cultural history within this framework is cast as the moment of the reflected reunion of being and its intrinsic attributes. The writing of that cultural or literary history, in turn, would be the sublimation of the violence present in the escalation of mimetic rivalry on the level of collective inter-dividualities. In other words, Brutus' sharp reply to Cassius can be translated into the cultural history of non-hegemonic cultures. Time to conclude. Collective inter-dividuality may bring closer mimetic theory and the non-hegemonic cultural contexts, as well as it may help to explain the symbolic violence which dominates our contemporary world in the age of social networks. However, I leave these possibilities open to your remarks and questions. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, João Cezar, for your presentation. Our next speaker is Matt Huff. He was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and studied theology and philosophy as an undergraduate at Fordham University. In 2022, he received his master's in theological studies from Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Matt's research interests include the relationship between theology, mysticism, spirituality, and political engagement, the theology and philosophy of Karl Rahner, Joan Baptist Metz, and Ignacio Ellacuría, the history and reception of liberation, political, and decolonial theologies, and the articulations of the church-state relationship within Christianity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. First, I want to say thank you to Carlos Mendoza, my advisor, who essentially voluntold me I would be speaking today. To Valentina for that introduction, to James Allison for being here and for providing so much rich material for us to reflect on and with. Also, I have some undergraduate colleagues of mine in the audience, so I'm glad that they're here. I'd say thank you to Brian Robinette, who first introduced me to René Girard. And so maybe just a word about kind of the origins of this. I took Brian and Jeremy's Lonergan and Girard course and immediately started thinking about the question of suffering, as for whatever reason I often do, and trying to think through this question in a Girardian sort of lens, and thinking through in a political lens as well. So I ended up writing this paper originally on Lonergan, Girard, and Ignacio Ellacuría. I told Jeremy Wilkins I cut Lonergan for today, so immediately he left. But I've been thinking around some of these ideas for a little while. This is still very much kind of work in progress. So I appreciate your generosity. So I actually wanted to begin with not literature, but poetry. So in a poem composed shortly after the ratification of the aptly titled Good Friday Agreement that brought an end to sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, the Belfast native and author Alan Gillis writes, "They say that for years Belfast was backwards, and it's great to see some progress. So I guess we can look forward to taking boxes from the earth. I guess the ambulances will leave the dying back amidst the rubble, to be explosively healed. Given time, 100,000 particles of glass will create impossible patterns in the air before coalescing into the clarity of a window, through which a reassembled head will look out and admire the shy young man taking his bomb from the building and driving home. Missing the peace ushered in by the agreement. Instead, I believe he is reminding us that despite the peace, the damage is done and there is no going back. As his country embarked on a new path forward, Gillis wanted to make sure that we remembered that progress isn't cheap. Hence why he asks us to linger on the troubling question, what do we do with injustice, with the grief and the pain of the past? How do we ensure that our desire for progress doesn't erase our attention to history's victims? Gillis's poem and the questions it raises remind me of Johann Baptist Metz's often repeated lament that despite the horrors of the 20th century, there is still too much Easter Sunday and not enough Good Friday in our theology. If we were to count the pages of all the theology written since he made that claim, I'm not so sure Metz's claim holds up, but I think his intuition is right, or at least it makes a lot of sense to me. It's hard not to look at the world right now and see an open wound. So with that in mind, I would like us to stay with Good Friday for a little while, and specifically the cross, and use it as a framework to think about politics and injustice. To do so, I'll briefly explore the role of the cross in René Girard's Mimetic theory and in Ignacio Ellacuría's political soteriology. The cross is central to both of their works. It is that social and historical fact that once reviewed conditions and provides insights into how each author believes we live as a community, how we live politically. While both authors may disagree with each other in certain areas, I believe reading them together reveals that they complement certain aspects of each other's thought as well. With that in mind, let's talk about Girard. So, the cornerstone of Mimetic theory is simple. To be human is to desire, and our desires are not ours alone. They are interconnected, interdividual maybe, collectively interdividual perhaps, and influenced by the desires of others. Desire is always a triangular relationship between three different poles: myself, the other, and the object desired. These triangular relationships can lead to conflict as two or more individuals vie for the desired object. Then built-up resentment can spill over into conflict between individuals and eventually communal conflict, what Girard calls mimetic contagion. And I quote him here, "This is an accumulation and eventual overflow of violence." So contagion needs to be excised from the community for it to return to peace. And this is done through a process called scapegoating, which is the process of victimization and destruction of a perceived threat to order. This mechanism transforms generalized violence into, quote, a war of all against one, by which the unity of the community is reestablished. The sacrifice of this scapegoat, this other, quote, redirects violence towards proper channels, or as I like to think about it, proper victims, for whom, quote, a crucial social link is missing. They can be exposed to violence without fear of reprisal. So scapegoating is also a circular prophecy, insofar as it identifies a solution to violent contagion through its choice of a victim, the social outcast, whose destruction or expulsion facilitates a psychological release, which then confirms the guilt of the victim in the very first place. So scapegoating, though, is not the end of the story in Girard's thought. Through the ministry, passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus, he believes, God has revealed scapegoating for what it is: the violent destruction of the innocent victim. Theologian Anne Astle helpfully summarizes, and I quote her, "From Girard's perspective, the scriptures impart a twofold revelation, that of a fallen humanity in its proneness to mimetic rivalry and collective violence, and that of God as a God of the victims. Both divine and human nature are revealed in these texts as insights that can break the cycle of mimetic contagion. Thus, quote, the continuous teaching of Christ's message through the diffusion of the Gospels is as important as this revelation in the first place." So Girard sees a certain victory to the cross, and he believes this as having actually and already occurred in history to an extent. He argues that, quote, the specific character of the modern world can be ascribed to the victory of the cross over Satan in the sense of a growing concern for victims everywhere in the world. James Allison notes, too, that the, quote, revelatory presence of the cross would have no significance unless it provoked simultaneously a certain shift in human understanding. The victory of the cross, Allison argues, quote, permitted a manner of looking upon reality that had previously been impossible, a human perception of reality that was not available while death was still a definitive reality for all humans. Allison calls this the intelligence of the victim, a theme we have been looking at yesterday and today as well, by which he understands what he understands to be, quote, an alteration in what constitutes human consciousness, permitting us to see things from the viewpoint of the victim and from the point of gratuitous self-donation. Given this shift in consciousness, we are able to see the, quote, ways in which we are constituted in violence, yet now able to overcome that violence through relationships of gratuitous love with others. Others, even if they then victimize us. At the same time, the intelligence of the victim shows us that God is an utterly nonviolent, gratuitous God in solidarity with victims. This realization should lead us to the beginning of our own penitent solidarity, to borrow another of James's phrases. Penitent because this solidarity asks us to look at our mimetic nature and our own victims. Quote, in being faced by our victim, James says, our idolatrous and objectifying gaze is reversed to a counter experience, so that we see ourselves from the perspective of our victim. His own work, I sort of discern two types of grace at work. So the first of these I want to call maybe a grace of knowledge or a grace of knowing, which is more properly understood as an epistemic shift towards the perspective of the victim and one's own mimetic nature and the tendency towards violence therein. A second type of grace I think is also discernible. This is what we might call a grace of positive mimesis or imitation. And this is the ability to channel one's actions and choices in a positive direction by choosing the right model to imitate. Since we cannot escape our mimetic nature, we are called to imitate models who propose a nonviolent solution to desire and to conflict. The model par excellence is Jesus, who calls us to imitate him, imitating God the Father. Nevertheless, Anne Astel reminds us that, quote, the propensity toward méconnaissance, however, remains in the members of the wayfaring church, who live in a world that strives to keep them ensnared by worldly desires and fears, and who depend continually on Christ's grace. So where does Girard's theory leave us? Returning again to Astel, she offers this helpful guidance. Quote, Girard maintains the importance of distance, of individual personhood, even in the positive undifferentiation of the order of charity, its moments of grace, works of mercy, and identification with Christ and others. Therefore, the Girardian interdividual remains someone profoundly affected by external influence, who nonetheless retains an innermost freedom of choice regarding the election of models, both divine and diabolical for desire. So we always have a choice to make in a Girardian mimetic anthropology. The gospel gives us, quote, two options, according to Girard. Either we imitate Christ, giving up our mimetic violence, or we run the risk of self-destruction. Girard contends that, quote, Christ alone allows us to face this reality without sinking into madness. To overcome this madness, we must gaze upon him who reveals our true humanity. The intelligence of the victim we receive through this active gaze challenges us, quote, to be imitators of God, from Ephesians 5:1. In the end, Girard offers us simply a profound truth. Love is the only way out of violence. And love requires us to cultivate an intelligence of the victims so that we might fully know ourselves so as to stand in solidarity with others. So at this point, I'll now turn to the work of Ignacio Ellacuría, a Jesuit philosopher, theologian, and martyr. His own theology of the cross takes a slightly different starting point. He begins with this persistence of sin and injustice, even after the passion and the resurrection of Jesus. So I'll quote him at length for a moment here. This is his words, anyone who looks with critically realistic eyes at the different scenarios of history can only wonder how we can say that history has already been saved. The coming of Jesus does not appear to have turned history into a history of salvation. It does not seem, so far as it comes from Jesus, has made enough of an impact as to divide history into what came before and what came after his birth. Always the provocateur, Ellacuría asks troubling follow-up questions like, did Jesus fail during his mortal life in the proclamation and the realization of the reign of God? And can the reign of God preached by Jesus only be realized beyond history, so that salvation is only offered in history, but not promised to history itself? So to answer these questions, Ellacuría develops a theory of what I call a political soteriology, in which the sacred and the profane are not separated realities, but radically linked in, quote, a single history that they serve. That is God's history, what God has done with all of nature, what God does in human history, and what God wants to result from God's constant self-giving. Another word for this might be historical transcendence, which Ellacuría uses quite often, which he understood as, quote, the primordial unity of the divine and human in history, in which, quote, transcendence presents itself as historical, and history, in turn, presents itself as transcendent, despite the great difficulty of finding adequate concepts to maintain the indivisible unity without confusion. So these conceptual frameworks, I believe, allow Ellacuría to argue that the death and resurrection of Jesus, while occurring in history, have transcendent meaning for all of history, and that the saving action of Jesus, quote, was carried out in order to continue in history. He then makes the controversial claim that history's victims, those he calls the crucified peoples, continue the salvific work of Jesus in history. To do this, Ellacuría interprets the death of Jesus through the servant song in Isaiah. But he does so with his historical transcendental approach, in which he writes regarding the suffering servant, this is a vast portion of humankind, which is literally and historically crucified. He wants to apply this to history. He says we can find this suffering servant in history. And he notes certain basic similarities towards the historical transcendent suffering servant in our midst and the vision from Isaiah. So he says, quote, any present day approximation of the servant will have to be crucified for the sins of the world. It will have to become what the worldly have cast out, and its appearance will not be human precisely because it has been dehumanized. It will have to have a high degree of universalization, since it will have to be a figure that redeems the whole world. It will have to suffer this utter dehumanization, not for its sins, but because it bears the sins of others. It will have to be cast out and despised precisely as Savior of the world, in such a way that this world does not accept it as Savior, but on the contrary, judges it as the most complete expression of what must be avoided and even condemned. For Ellacuría, the poor of the third world, he would say, fit this description, certainly reflecting the language of his 1980s context in which he wrote this essay. This leads to the stunning conclusion that the crucified people, quote, besides being the main object of the effort of salvation, might also, in its very crucified situation, be the principle of salvation for the whole world. He recognizes that this position is scandalous, especially for those who, quote, find it easy to regard the oppressed and needy as those who are to be saved and liberated, while finding it difficult to, quote, see them as saviors and liberators themselves. Nonetheless, he is convinced that the crucified peoples of the world are the historical standard bearers of the saving work of Jesus today. So is he bluffing? Is this just some high-minded rhetoric? What's going on here? Does he believe this? So Kevin Burke, an Ellacuría scholar, notes that the crucified people, quote, is not merely a colorful metaphor for human suffering in general, nor does it simply represent the sum total of all individual injuries and grief. It refers to a historical theological reality that embraces a communion of victims in history. So just as Jesus, the victim, instituted our salvation through the victory over the cross, this communion of crucified victims is the principle of Christ's salvific work in history now. Okay, but how does this beautiful and provocative theological interpretation actually touch the ground? In a move reminiscent of Girard, John Sobrino draws on Ellacuría's concept to argue that the crucified people are, quote, a light for the nations, able to show the nations what they truly are, a light whose power is capable of unmasking lies. This community reveals the dichotomy between salvation proclaimed and salvation realized. Importantly, the crucified peoples do so in a communal way that is reminiscent of biblical understandings of salvation achieved precisely as a people, as a collective. While admitting the complexity of identifying the crucified people with a specific group in history, Ellacuría argues that the concept is precise enough to categorize and discern salvific actors in history. And so, to quote him again, to mention some examples. The first world is not in line with the suffering servant, he would say, yet the third world is. The rich and oppressive classes are not, and the oppressed classes are. Those who serve oppression are not, no matter what they suffer in that service, and those who struggle for justice and liberation are. So we may want to maybe add some nuance to those claims, but this is sort of the type of thinking Ellacuría is engaged in. And also, despite any nuance we might want to add, I think Ellacuría has a fundamental insight here. For crucifixion to occur, there must be a crucifier. And for crucifixion to occur on a grand scale, we must speak of crucifying communities, crucifying peoples, crucifying countries. If nothing else, the crucified people reveal much about the ongoing nature of violence in our world. However, the crucified people are not simply passive. This is often a concern in the kind of formulation, and I think it's a valid concern. Ellacuría, he wants to sort of resist that. He writes, quote, "Salvation does not come through the mere fact of crucifixion and death. Only a people that lives because it has risen from death, inflicted on it, can save the world." So the crucified people, in their efforts of resistance and creative re-existence, enact their own liberation, as well as those of us who help take them down from their crosses. We participate in salvation history here and now. So Ellacuría argues that, quote, it is God in the poor who will save history, but in real poor people who really operate in history, when within their material condition of poverty, they recover their total beatitude, the gift of God. Reflecting on Ellacuría's concept, Sean Copeland, our very own Boston College Sean Copeland, articulates with precision the deep theological implication of the crucified people. Quote, "These crucified people are the only sure sign of God's presence in our world. For these children, women, and men offer us a graced and saving encounter with God's mercy, compassion, and love." So I believe these are important principles for political theology, which we'll get into in the next section. But just briefly, this notion of historic transcendence is a reminder that God's promises require historicization or continuation in history. The work of salvation always continues now. Likewise, other fundamental theological categories like resurrection, grace, sin, always occur in history in an ongoing way. The crucified people offer a host of important insights for us. First, they're a reminder of the dichotomy between the reign of God proclaimed and realized. They illuminate the dynamics at work in the world that lead to crucifixion. And third, they are a principle of salvation for the world, because through their experience of crucifixion, they have the keenest insight of what the reign of God is not. So let me conclude a little bit here by trying to put some of these principles from Girard into dialogue with some of the principles from Ellacuría and liberation theology. So what does this have to do with political theology? It's a good question, and one that I'm still trying to work out. And what might these two perspectives teach each other? First, a few thoughts on mimetic theory and what it might offer a liberationist or political perspective. Girard's anthropology, which acknowledges our tendency towards violence, both individually and socially, which is expressed most brutally in scapegoating, as well as the power of the cross to dispel violence, challenges each of us to, quote, undergo a conversion beyond the morally black and white thinking that typifies entrapment and mimetic rivalry, and instead urges us to, quote, share mimetically in Christ's non-rivalrous desire, which uproots self-definitional hatred against the despised other and the violence that follows. The intelligence of the victim adds complexity and defies easy categories of oppressor and oppressed by asking us to allow ourselves to be confronted by our violent tendencies. This epistemic shift, one to say about oneself without fear or shame, I was wrong, and I'd like to be right. James Allison reminds us that being wrong is simply being human. And this is an especially important critique of liberationist discourses that contend towards reductionism in their analyses of the causes of violence. Michael Kerwin, a political theologian and Girard scholar, levels two important Girardian critiques at what he views as inherent tensions within liberation theology. First, he notes a tendency to scapegoat one's oppressors or perceived enemies. So in this case, perhaps the global north, liberalism, capitalism, human rights discourse, pick whichever one you like. But no single theory alone can account for the situation of the global south, for the factors contributing to violence and poverty are multifaceted and complex. And as mimetic theory reminds us, the lines between oppressor and oppressed are often much blurrier than we might like to admit. Second, following on the foundational role of violence in human sociality, Kerwin argues that while many political and liberation theologians rightly, quote, voice an Antigone-like protest against the abuses of power, this is not the same as addressing the problematic violence at the root of politics itself. So again, there can be this entrapment in these types of liberationist discourses that want to challenge sort of the sin of oppression and its specificity, but often do so by turning to a mimetic kind of violence, or so Kerwin would say. But at the same time, I think that liberation theologians, and especially someone like Ignacio Ellacuría, has something also to offer to a mimetic theory here. So first of all, these discourses remind us that violent, life-ending scapegoating is a ever-present, omnipresent reality in our world, despite the victory of the cross. João Aguilar Ramirez and Stephen de Beer argue that one of the ongoing gifts of liberation theology has been its ability to, quote, acknowledge the suffering voices of the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable as the voices of victims of contemporary forms of sacrifice. Kerwin himself makes this connection as well when he notes that Girard's scapegoating in liberation theology's concept of the idolatrous nature of capitalism, for instance, and wealth are potentially analogous. So the sacrifice that idolatry requires is always specific, and figures like Ellacuría provide tools to discern both the sacrificed, who they are, as well as its underlying idolatry, why it happened. So let me end with Ellacuría, whose radical questioning of the efficacy of the cross in the face of so much violence inspired my reflections here today. His unique contribution to this conversation, I believe, rests squarely with his theory of the crucified people. This theological category is a reminder that Christ's death and resurrection are ongoing realities in history. Moreover, these crucified people remind us not only to ask why this suffering continues, they also remind us that God works salvation through them. As such, any political theology rooted in specific Christian love for the victims of history leads us inevitably to the foot of the cross. It is here at that original ground zero, theme Carlos is going to talk about shortly, where I'll conclude by offering the last word to Ellacuría himself. Quote, what I would ask, because the word demand sounds too strong, involves two things. First, that you look with your eyes and your heart at these people who are suffering so much, some from poverty and hunger, others from oppression and repression. Then, because I'm a Jesuit, I would bid you pray the colloquy of St. Ignatius from the first week of the exercises, before this crucified people, asking yourself, what have I done to crucify them? What am I doing to end their crucifixion? And what should I do so this people might rise from the dead? Thank you very much. Long introduction.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for your presentation. Our last and most important speaker, Carlos Mendoza Alvarez. He is a Mexican citizen and friar of the Order of Preachers from the province of San James in Mexico. Doctor in theology with habilitation in fundamental theology, full professor in the theology department at Boston College. Throughout 30 years, he has developed a fundamental theology in a critical dialogue with late modernity, where the phenomenology of subjectivity, mimetic theory, and decolonial thought in dialogue with social movements in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. He has published 8 books of personal authorship, 30 collective works, and more than 60 articles in specialized journals. His latest book, published in 2019, La Resurrección como Anticipación Mesiánica, Duelo, Memoria y Esperanza desde los Sobrevivientes, is the beginning of a trilogy of the idea of tradition as performativity of faith from the resistance of systemic victims. Welcome, Carlos.
Well, let me first of all share my screen because I know all of us were a little bit tired, but just a minute because what are you doing? I'm just how can I open my? Where is it? think it's this one. Yeah. And then, okay, I'm going to share with you some PowerPoint presentation with some the main ideas that I would like to advance, talking about political theology related to mimetic theory, but also the colonial thinking. And can you turn off the number 2, please? But I added also some paintings and pictures because I think artistic narrative is a counterpart of conceptual thinking. It's another way of address reality. And I'm all the time very grateful to the artists because they help us to understand differently what life is about. So my presentation is about political eschatological inter-dividuality, discussing with Professor João Cezar, the Castro Rocha in his category, from the debris or the rubbles of the identity self. Of course, this is the wall in Tijuana, San Diego, the border where many people, artists particularly, they have been trying to transform this symbol of differentiation between different peoples in a place of gathering. And I think that's a powerful image of the idea of political and eschatological inter-dividuality. So, first of all, let me remind you a little bit the context about the political, what I'm in some way assuming here. First of all, is the political as was presented by liberation theologians in 60 years ago, particularly Clodovis Boff, the young, because there is a Clodovis Boff, the elder, who took really distance from liberation theology in a very radical way. So you know this story between the two brothers, Leonardo and Clodovis, a kind of mimesis probably between the two of them. But the political and American theological thought was related as or expressed as a praxis of liberation, related not only in Marxist terms, like an infiltration of Marxism in theology, but the praxis coming from God. The first act, according to Gustavo Gutierrez, for instance, in Liberation Theology book, is God's love creating and redeeming the world. So it's the priority and the source of the option for the poor is deeply related to this praxis of God, but is also related to the turn of the modern Enlightenment, particularly 19th century, the three masters of suspicion, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, who were in some way reframing the concept of praxis, trying to understand better how human agency as a source of praxis and related to autonomy processes, social and political processes. So particularly Clodovis Boff used to talk about this, what the politic or the political, I prefer to use that expression, in order to understand how God is acting, is revealing in the midst of suffering, something that Matt, you have been in some way exploring with Ellacuría, right? This kind of art from Valentina, Nicaragua, expresses this kind of historical understanding of the crucifixion. It's not only an act of self-giveness or self-offering, but is produced by political powers and political structures. And the people of God who is crucified with Jesus of Nazareth in some ways also related to this process of witnessing, testifying a different way of living, a different way of understanding human condition. But according to Clodovis Boff the Young, there is a socioanalytical mediation, absolutely important to address the question of the political. Ask using the lens of social sciences in order to explain the social praxis, first of all, of the ecclesial-based communities, because it's a very ecclesial way of understanding the political, and also the revolutionary movements in the time that explore other ways of building the common or the political by means of the establishment of democratic regimes in the region, in the context, of course, of the Cold War. This is a picture took by Laurel Marshall Potter, our colleague here at DC, of base communities in El Salvador. Of course, in the center, Monsignor Romero, the witness of these crucified people, but also risen people in some way. The Salvadorian people will be risen in, I'd be risen in the life of the Salvadorian people, he used to say. So, but there was a failure that liberation theologians and all those social movements were facing in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, struggling for the political in order to transform injustice and structural injustice. And many of them, they conquered in some way the power in different countries after civil wars or even guerrilla. And but there was a failure because they were reproducing the same system, economic and political system, belonging to the modern understanding of institutions like state, run by governments and political parties, or the traditional way to understand education, school, for instance, health, use in hospitals, and all these kind of tools and devices that modernity and the welfare state developed in Europe particularly, but then they were exported in some way to the Americas. But the question is that those regimes failed in some way because they didn't resolve the main injustice system that was producing their life. In some of the cases, for instance, in Chile, well, was in some way stopped by the intervention of USA government and CIA. But the question is how this kind of failure in the context of the Cold War was also related to the collapse of the utopia in the communist regimes. And that's why the praxis of liberation for base communities and many Christians involved in revolutionary movements failed also at the end of the 80s. And then in the 90s, there were some other experiments in some way from the leftist parties in Brazil, in Chile, in Argentina, not really, but in other places in Latin America, trying to find the political as a mediation to transform the injustice situation of the communities. But what happened probably, and we need to include the context of after the Cold War, is the new actors were at global scale in some way appearing like the transnational companies who were producing their life, but also the criminal mafias. I like this picture, is Christ and Shiva in some way, but the crucified people is all related to the market. And it's a global market where, for instance, Chinese capital is very important too. So the question is, the new context in 21st century is in some way addressing new questions to rethink the political. I mentioned in there the idea coming from Achille Mbembe of necropower to understand not anymore the welfare state, but the state run by criminal mafias, which is a narco state. It's not only in my country, in Mexico or in El Salvador or in other places, but criminal mafias also in the USA, related to political parties and to transnational companies all over the globe. So the question is, in my understanding, how this transformation of the context of about the political affected deeply liberation theologians, and then opened the path towards a new understanding of liberation as a process of decolonization. That's why decolonial thinking raised in some way related to liberation theology. Particularly Enrique Dussel is one example of this process of expanding the horizon of how to analyze injustice, the structural sin, but using different analysis, not only socioanalytical analysis, as in the first generation of liberation theology was proposed. So in this way, the decolonial turn of the political, it's very important, in my understanding, to understand today what political theology is about. We are not facing the same situation as 60 years ago, the base communities and the popular movements, but we are facing a violence, a structural and systemic violence related to other logic, which is the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being, that has been addressed, of course, by Aníbal Quijano in Peru, but also here in the US, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Catherine Walsh, and some other scholars who have been in some way understanding better how the political has been transformed in a global scale by this neo-colonial power. In that way, to rethink the political from the cracks of power, we need to rethink what it means, the political, because it's related to patriarchy, related to racism, and I'd like to add all the time, inspired by Girard, sacrificial religion. Because necropower needs an ideological justification for any kind of confrontation today in different wars in different parts of the globe. There is an ideological, I wouldn't call that theological, but ideological religious justification of war. So this is Bordado de Violeta Parra. She was one of the most, well, there are Chileans here, one of the important singers and poets in Chile during the dictatorship. And it's a broderie, right? That kind of. Well, the question is how this decolonial turn is reshaping what the political means. And that's where I think mimetic theory perspective is an important tool to go deeper, but not deeper the understanding of what violence is about. So mimetic theory, 60 years ago, started to understand that in a different way, a complementary approach, the analysis of structural violence, but turning to the anthropological analysis of these processes of violence as origin of the culture, this internal and external mediation of desire, all that João Cezar has been explained very carefully today in Girard's work. But in my understanding, the contribution of mimetic theory is deeply related to structural violence brought from inside, trying to dismantle what is the cause producing their life in some way. And I use a lot this expression coming from Giorgio Agamben and Precarious Life, Judith Butler, to underline what kind of life has been threatened by the structural violence, structural sin. So the question is, the mimetic perspective in some way has been moving, in my understanding of Girard, from a first period in the 60s of trying to describe the mimetic desire and the scapegoating process to a more apocalyptic rationality. At the end of his life, Girard used to have a very apocalyptic tone in order to prevent in some way humanity that the end is coming. What it means, the end, is a chronological end or is a kairological end? So that's why messianic temporality, and Madeleine Jarrett, you know pretty well about this, or creep time in disability studies, there is a connection between the two of them. The question is, how can we reframe the political if we have in mind this kind of apocalyptic rationality, which means the confrontation between Satan's lie and Messiah's truth. This is the choice that we are facing following Girard. We have this choice, or reproducing the scapegoating process in a more individual manner or inter-dividual, or choosing the Messiah's truth, which represent or means sometimes offering life. So the question addressed by Girard, particularly at the end of his works, is deeply related to this confrontation where there is the character of the catejon who appears there. And this is deeply related to this rationality of the end of time. The catejon in Greek, there's only 2 times that is appearing in the second letter to the Thessalonians by Paul, is related to a character that is in some way delaying the last battle between the Messiah and the anti-Messiah. So the catejon is like a monster, and the political theology has been deeply all the time related to the state. The state in some way is, there are 2 different factors. In some way prolongs the end of the violent spiral, but there is a positive aspect of the catejon, which is it's in some way holding back the final collapse. So that's why the catejon is a very paradoxical character that is deeply related to messianic temporality. We are in the time of end, but not in a chronological sense, but in a more anthropological sense, which means that we need to make choices, or reproducing violence in this spiral of scapegoating processes, or stop the process in our own bodies. That's the Messiah's truth. And that has been experienced by Jesus of Nazareth in the cross, but by any other righteous of the nations in history. The witness, in some way, I read in these apocalyptic terms, witnessing like in this, using this category of the catejon, trying to avoid, to stop the spiral of violence in our own bodies. I like this Dali's the painting of the apocalyptic writer. The catejon, a monster, but well, it's more than a monster. It's modern state. It's probably narco state or the criminal mafias. It's probably ourselves reproducing this kind of rivalry at an inter-individual scale. So the question is, in my understanding, that to rethink the political in this new context of 21st century, different to liberation theology 60 years ago, allows us to understand differently history from a eschatological point of view. And that's where, for instance, James Allison helped us to understand this kind of eschatological tension that is internal to every human being, every creature, I would say. And then it's a choice for a kind of agency in order to reconnect to the inner self, using that expression of Thomas Merton, but in order to, as a dynamism of subversion. Subversion of what? Of the resentment. That's why mimetic theory go deeper than liberation theology, which was talking a lot about the structures of injustice. But mimetic theory is like it's an anthropological lens that helps us to understand better the implications, the subjective and intersubjective implications to overcome polarization. That demands a kind of conversion. Not only moral conversion, following Jesus of Nazareth, but it's an epistemic conversion. And that's why my way to talk about the intelligence of the victim. Epistemic, moral, but also political conversion. We need to take the side of those who are invisible in history, who have been scapegoated in some way, but also they have been invisibilized or getting invisible by different criminal powers in this kind of apocalyptic temporality. So from there, in some way, Politicas is subverted using this mimetic lens to the concept, and that's the concept of inter-dividuality, proposed by João Cezar de Castro Rocha. You will tell me, João, if I am interpreting your proposals in a right way. Rated as a poetics of emulation. In some way, well, you have been describing very carefully in your book, Shakespearean Cultures, published just a year ago in English, right? This side of how the Latin American cultures have been in some way exposed to imitation first of the metropoles in Europe for 2 or 3 centuries, but then they have been reinventing their identity in a poetics of, through poetics of emulation. In that way, they have been also the hegemonic narratives as subalterns. And in that way, Latin American culture in some, is an epistemology coming from the survivors of this systemic violence. And that's why I think there's a decolonial accent in this idea of poetics of emulation. You will let me know, João Cezar, later, if I'm right or not. That's why your work inspired in my own understanding of inter-dividuality. It's another way to address the issue of mimicking the other, not only as an individual, but as a people, as a culture, mimicking others, but speaking our own languages, our own epistemologies, not only mimicking the others. And that's why, and this is the third part of this short presentation, I would like to suggest some access for a political theology beyond the sentiment. Let me take this phrase from you, James, going beyond being beyond resentment is also a source for a new political theology. In some way, how the victims, they transform a wall of hate into a place of life, for instance. That's a kind of subversion. Many of those artists are decolonial artists and so on. This is in LA, trying to represent like the Latino heritage, but of course, related also to Black Lives Matter and other movements that are trying to stop in their own bodies the rage and the spiral of violence. So first of all, I think there is an important element of this political theology, which is ontological. Because of course, and your work, James, has been deeply related to this pneumatological anthropology, which is about becoming humans from another other who welcome us as we are. It's not a kind of battle between me and you, on us and they, but this is like what the Holy Spirit is about, right? And your lecture, the Cadelmas lecture last Wednesday was in some way related to this ontological, a new way of being given by the other, of course, inviting us to a new creation. But in some way is related to what João Cezar de Castro Rocha also proposed, being a alio. In some way is a permanent process in order to overcome this polarization, because ab alio represents related to the other, but the other not as a threat or as the enemy, but the other as a call in order to go beyond the rivalry and the mimetic desire. That's why this mimetic rivalry as ontological determination is the starting point for a new process of conversion. And that's why inter-dividuality raises as a new possibility to recreate who we are as human beings. This ontology is based on Pacific mimesis, right? It's not the choices between Satan's lie and Messiah's truth, or violent mimesis or Pacific mimesis. Of course, it's more paradoxical than just the oppositions, because all the time we're dealing with these two possibilities in an individual level, but also in a more communal one. For instance, the two different subaltern people who are fighting for having the first place in their nation. I would say the difference between the Latinos and the Black Americans here in the US, sometimes they don't find the way to live together, even if they are suffering in some analogical way, different kinds of exclusion. So the question is, the Pacific mimesis is related to how to build a common us, right? Beyond the unanimity, excluding the other, the different, or choosing one in order to survive ourselves. what the question is about, and I like this this painting. Wir sind das Volk. That's in German, in Berlin. We are so the diversity of races, of gender, or social class in some way is like the source of this possibility of new interrelationship between each other. So, and what you mentioned, James, in this text, Christ crucified, I like the last paragraph very much, because you are describing what the crucified Messiah is in some way showing us, is calling us to occupy that place, the ground zero. The cross is a ground zero, and you mentioned that, right? Is like the collapse of the hegemonic societies. In those cracks, in those rubbles, that's where life arises. I'm going to occupy that place, your ground zero. And so strong that losing is not a problem, because I'm losing so as to show you that you no longer have to live like that. That's the power of God. And I think the subalterns, they show us in this way another way to create communality of the political. Let me give you an example. The mothers of disappeared people in Mexico, more than 120,000 people disappeared in the last 20 years. But the mothers, they support each other, creating political bonds through their shared vulnerability, looking for their children. They continue suffering, their wounds still open, but at the same time, they are connecting each other and creating a potency, a power between them. And this is a way of understanding like the power of the subalterns, of the victim, when they touch each other. It's a very embodied process of taking care of each other, crying together, dancing together, enjoying together life right now. When they found a human remain and they can bring back that human remains to their families, for them it's like a triumph. It's an experience of resurrection. All the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, they have been struggling for 50 years, looking for their children or grandchildren. And each time that they can recover one of those children or grandchildren, for them is like an experience of resurrection. And this is a political bond. Feminist authors, Rita Laura Segato in Argentina and many others, they insist that the resistance coming from women facing patriarchy, in this case, for instance, the mother of the Plaza de Mayo or the mothers of disappeared, they are like the expression of a new political bonds created from the vulnerability of the victims themselves. So I think this is the ontological aspect of any political theology that would like to address the question of the systemic violence today in the world. A second element for political theology today in understanding is anthropological. We have been discussing the second roundtable, right, the second panel this morning, the anthropological aspect. Of course, which is important is like the logic of the becoming ourselves, overcoming resentment, because it's not about identity affirmation, but it's about the welcoming of the otherness as a source of knowledge. And in that sense, Cezar de Castro, you speak about poetics of emulation in the sense of this epistemic conversion. We need to acknowledge each other. I like this other painting from Olivia Tavares de Araujo. We too were modern, because in some ways expressing the struggle of Afro-Brazilian people in order to recreate their identity, related to their diasporic experience of being children of slaves in Brazil, but at the same time recreating their life, their dignity, rooted in this kind of ancestry. Where, for instance, gender diversity is present, interculturality, of course, even interreligious experience of the self. In that way, this anthropological aspect of the political I think is absolutely relevant today in order to overcome polarization, because that's the question we wanted to address in this colloquium. But there is a third element which is related to the cross. And you mentioned that for Ellacuría and Matt and also Girard. Here, the crucified is a woman. She's a black woman, right? In some way, queer theology has been exploring this kind of new expression of the cross related to gender, to race, more intersectional analysis. But the question is how the process of subjectivation needs to be in some way deconstructed. And then also introducing new elements which are deeply related to subjectivities who have been expelled or ignored or getting invisible. And that's why I like to, once again, connect this idea of political as in some way of gratuitousness to the problem of the holiness code. You were talking about that in your lecture about also fiducia supplicans, but it's a common trend in your thinking, right, James? Rooted in Girard also understanding. But what is important to me in order to connect this as an element of the political theology is that the extrinsic goodness, that's the Satan's lie in some way, the extrinsicity of goodness. And then that's why the cross in some way represents, in my understanding, like a subversion of this extrinsic goodness in order to discover the intrinsic goodness being given by the other who names us as we are, and who likes us as we are. In that way, the politicas of gratuitousness raising from the wounds of the crucified peoples. They have, those crucified peoples, they have potency, power. I don't like the word power in English, but the potency I prefer. They have an inner strength that allow them, the subalterns, the victims, and so on, to go beyond this kind of process of rivalry. Of course, the condition sine qua non is overcome resentment, but connecting each other through the wounded body of each other, and then finding new political bonds. So the eschatological inter-dividuality, that's an expression that I would like to propose here for the following conversation, Ross Cezar, because you talk about the collective inter-dividuality, and I think it's absolutely relevant, but I would like to add the element of eschatological dimension, which is a process of, is a battle in messianic times, waiting for the accomplishment of history. In that sense, the eschatological individuality is related to the Pacific mimesis. And there's a quote here from your text, João Cezar, Shakespearean Cultures, about what collective individuality is about. It's an expression of the poetics of emulation, which equals the goods of dignity and hope to confront the ongoing political discourses of hate and domestic terrorism in many countries and regions. And I like the last paragraph, it's very powerful. Non-hegemonic cultures are defined by the act of appropriating the hegemonic other, using it as fuel of trying to forge increasingly heteroclite identities, ontologically polyglot ones. So in that way, the subalterns are transforming, subverting oppression, but not in a rivalristic model, if I can say that in that way, but in a more political, subvertive way of getting together again. That's the potency coming from the victims. And I think that we can find a kind of element of eschatological element of this common good, which is given by God, but now we can experience that good through the resistance of the victims. And then, which is last a conclusion, I like the paintings there, because there are indigenous subalterns, different kinds of subalterns, Maya, Zapatista people, queer
bodies, and so on. Women who are trying in some way to subvert in their own bodies the hegemonic narratives, creating bonds of inter-dividuality, but experiencing in a deeper sense the conversion in their own minds, in their own, I would underline bodies, because bodies matter, related to race, gender, social class, and so on. So political communities in some way will be emerging from the wounds of the crucified Messiah, that's the Christian narrative, by connecting vulnerabilities of those who have been the scapegoats to create networks of mutual care as political bonds, calling for the conversion of the perpetrators because they are part of the community. And they have been in some way also have been afflicted by any different kinds of violence. It's a call for the conversion of the perpetrators, including today the ecclesiastical clericalism and the political populism, to participate in this new creation. And then improving communality as a political bond, mutual recognition, dismantle the sacrificial logic, and opening room to the communion in diversity. Thank you so much. I think we can come here, right? Yeah. This from Diane. Pero ahora lo que... Where is João?
So thank you, João, Cezar, thank you, Matt, thank you, Carlos, for your presentations. We want now to invite James Allison to offer some insights, reactions to what our colleagues have been presenting.
Oi, João, prazer te ver.
Oi, James, tudo bom?
James is a polyglot, so you can speak in Portuguese.
I've had the privilege of sharing platforms with João in Brazil before, so it's a true pleasure to be with you again, João. If I can accept your invitation to take something you were saying further, one of the really interesting ways you've been discussing mimetic theory recently, particularly because of the last 4 years of the political history in Brazil, has been the theme of cognitive dissonance. And I'm very keen to hear you explain more of how your understanding of cognitive dissonance fits in with what you told us, if that's a possible request for you to explore, because I thought it very valuable for understanding part of the craziness of the mimetic world with the social media that you've put a finger on as something important. So that was a first question, if I may raise that. And the second, which I can raise together with Matt and with Carlos. I think it's the same question. With the initial explanation from Ellacuría, with the notion of the suffering people, and you described how you actually put words in, or not put words into her mouth, but used Sean Copeland talking about this, was the notion of this as a graced state in and of itself. And there seems to be something very Pelagian about that. And Carlos brought it out more by talking about how this is, well, no, but bringing the key point, because it's only grace if it's able to transmit something to us. And the whole point about it, of course, is that mostly it's invisible, except unless people like Ellacuría go there and tell us about it. in terms of telling first world people about it, and then, in his case, become a martyr, attempting to give voice to people who wouldn't otherwise be. So it's the question of the visible. You mentioned this as well, the invisible and the invisibilized, and the way in which this becomes visible, this becomes capable of communication. And that seems to me to be a huge communicational question for us. How does something which it's difficult to see how it's grace, either for those belonging to it or in terms of what it's offering the rest of us, unless there's some communicational movement from and to it. Does that make sense? So that was my question, which I just wanted to put out there. So you all astray.
João Cezar, do you want to start?
Not so much invisible, it's audible.
First, let me thank the hate rhetoric, as I call it, in order of hate speech. And something that has been amazing me tremendously, I do not have yet a full answer. I'll just raise some points. And it seems to me that the cognitive dissonance, the collective cognitive dissonance, as I have been proposing, relates directly to the collective interdivisibility, but above all, James, it strikes me as if we would have a scapegoat mechanism revived in the contemporary world, especially through the social networks and thanks to the digital universe. But it is as if, James, and this is what I do not have yet a full reflection developed, so I'm sure you and Carlos and Martin and everyone may help me. It is as if we have a scapegoat mechanism that prevails in our everyday life. And if you just see the vocabulary employed spontaneously in the social networks, the cancel out culture, virtual lynching, so forth and so on, it is as if we have in action a scapegoat mechanism with no possibility of méconnaissance, because what you do have is a sort of a jouissance. And that relates to the radicalization of the notion of polarization that it seems to me to be very important to Carlos and in his insightful presentation. So it seems to me, James, that the only way we have to face the predicament of this collective cognitive dissonance would be to try something that perhaps Girard would not put in those terms, but I take advantage of what Carlos has said, the path towards a peaceful mimesis. I think that there are two ways of perhaps achieving this result. The first is never to forget that we always have to put emphasis on the object, that the crisis of indifferentiation can only take place when the object is neglected, is overlooked, because the rivalry is now between the roles that have been indifferentiated, subject and model. So always put an emphasis on the object. And there is a second level, and this, I would say it very tentatively, James, I'm just starting to think about it. I have been rereading very carefully The Merchant of Venice. And actually in this new book, there are three plays by Shakespeare that will have a part of plays. Richard III, Titus Andronicus, and The Merchant of Venice. There is this very famous speech by Shylock in the first scene of the third act. We all know the speech, I'm sure. It is a speech where Shylock, after suffering just because he's a Jew, there is this terrible anti-Semitism which crosses throughout the play. All the characters are terribly anti-Semitic, and they do not realize what they're doing. And this is what's really striking about the play. So there is this moment when, and I'm trying here, there is this moment when Iago tells them, but why is he be treated this way? And then he says, because I'm a Jew. But then he says, and I quote now, I have it here now, it says, doesn't a Jew have hands, organs, human figure, human senses, feelings and passions? I'm trying to get the whole quote here, just a second. They're a very famous quote. Where is it? I haven't prepared to read this quote. Anyway, you all know the quote. He says it, I'm a Jew, but don't we have the same body? Don't we have the same expectations? Don't we have the same feelings? So the first step taken by Shylock to confront the scapegoaters is to rehumanize himself. He says, we are all humans. We share some common features. Above all, the finitude. If we are hurt, we will bleed. If we are poisoned, we will die. But then by the end, Shylock says that the word that perhaps he should have not been uttered. He says, so if I'm offended by Christians, should I not act as Christian? In other words, should I not revenge? And this is the moment where the play gets a completely different turn. What I'm trying to say, James, very hesitantly, I'm starting to think about it. The collective cognitive dissonance poses a very, very difficult problem. I repeat, it is as if we have a scapegoat mechanism in which méconnaissance was replaced by jouissance. And second, it seems to me that the way to overcome this radical polarization that all over the world, not only in Brazil, not only in France, but in the United States, all over this radical polarization in which one pole does not try to overcome the other, tries to eliminate the other, we will have this very difficult task of rehumanize ourselves, but at the same time, we will have to humanize the scapegoaters themselves. It seems to me that perhaps those two ways, never neglect the object, rehumanize ourselves as Shylock does, but also humanize the scapegoaters themselves. So perhaps that will allow us to deal differently with the cognitive dissonance. But James, many thanks for bringing to the discussion this concept that I have also been trying to develop over the past years. Muito obrigado, James.
It's funny because I think the one Ellacuría reference himself that he might or the one he references, which I think that worries the most about is Manichaean. More of light and dark, crucifier, I think it's more used to identify, like explicitly more in his kind of way. But this point on grace, I've been thinking a lot about certification spirituality because I'm teaching the undergraduate this week, and also Ellacuría is so deeply Ignatian, I think, this entire formulation of even the essays I drew on, the crucified people essay, I think really emerged from his experience of doing the spiritual exercise. In that first week, really, contemplating one's sinfulness, looking at the sinful world, imagining oneself asking the crucified Christ this question, right? But in terms of communication, I think there's an element that Ellacuría kind of misses when I was rereading Ignatius himself. After that famous colloquy, what have I done to Christ? All that kind of stuff. There's another couple lines that I'm sure Henry and the other Jesuits might remember, and this is just Ignatius. A colloquy is made, properly speaking, in a way one friend speaks to another. And so there's this kind of communication here is that, and this is, I think, a Copeland's point, is that it's not simply that the grace just resides in the universe. these crucified people simply to their crucifixion. There's this communicative, relational kind of calling, like a friendship that sort of almost, there's the friendship is the grace, and the grace of the friendship, maybe, that's being sort of called to here. So I don't know if that fully answers kind of the question, but I found that sort of striking. And, anyways, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to comment a little bit about the phrase that you mentioned, both James and João, humanize the skateboarders. This is a path toward reconciliation, of course, but from the perspective of whom, I would ask. Because, for instance, the mothers of the disappeared, they humanize the perpetrators, trying to think in their place why they did this to my son or my daughter, why they did were hiding the bodies in that cave, or but it's a political action, not inspired by resentment, or by seeking truth. The truth, a very practical truth. Where is my daughter? Where is my son? Where is body, her body, body? And this is another way to address the question of humanizing the other, and also calling for conversion. But I would say this cognitive dissonance is deeply related to our perspective. Where are we located? With whom we are in some way trying to understand life. These processes of overcoming that life. For me, it's very important the point of view of the subaltern themselves. They have a wisdom, an understanding of life, or space, of bodies, or human lives, of political bonds of economy, that we need to understand that. Scholars, theologians, or even persons. Just a comment.
So we don't have more time for questions, but we have a social, so we can share and ask our questions.
Yeah.
So thank you for being here, and see you.
Hey, João.
João?
Yes. I was listening on the iPhone. Actually, I'm not listening well from the laptop, but I'm here.
Yeah, it's over. So we want to thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos, for the invitation. Thank you.